she thought rock bottom had a floor, until she found out it had a basement. Sarah Mitchell sat on the edge of a gas station curb at 3 a.m, her daughter Emma asleep against her shoulder, and stared at the envelope that had arrived at the shelter 2 days ago. The paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting shaky like the hand that wrote it had been fighting time itself, and the message inside had felt like a cruel joke wrapped in legal language. An inheritance. From an aunt she barely remembered, a woman who existed only in fragments of childhood memory, a stern face at a funeral, a Christmas card that stopped coming when Sarah was 12, a farm she'd never seen in a state she'd never visited. The lawyer's voice on the phone had been matter-of-fact, almost bored, as he explained that Judith Brennan had passed 6 months prior and left her only living relative 140 acres in rural Montana. 140 acres. Sarah had laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound that cut through the fluorescent hum of the shelter's common room and made the other women look away, uncomfortable with the edge of hysteria in it. What was she supposed to do with a farm? She didn't have a car, didn't have money for gas if she did, didn't have anything except a sleeping 7-year-old, 2 garbage bags of clothes that smelled like the laundromat they couldn't afford, and a pride that had been ground down to nothing over the past 18 months of couch surfing, shelters, and the particular humiliation of explaining to your daughter why she couldn't have a real birthday party this year. But the lawyer had mentioned something else, a stipulation. She had to come see the property within 30 days or it would be sold to cover back taxes. The county needed their money. The state didn't care about sentimentality. That was 28 days ago. Now, with $73 in her pocket, money earned cleaning motel rooms under the table, and a bus ticket purchased with the last of her dignity and a maxed-out credit card she'd never be able to pay off, Sarah was watching the sun come up over mountains she'd only seen in pictures, in magazines and dentist offices, in the screensavers of computers at the library where she'd spent hours applying for jobs that never called back. The Greyhound station in Whitehall, Montana was barely more than a covered bench and a vending machine that didn't work, its coin slot jammed with something that looked like old gum. The air smelled different here. Pine and dust and something clean that hurt her lungs after 2 years of breathing, city exhaust and shelter disinfectant. Emma woke as they stepped off the bus, her eyes still heavy with sleep, her hair matted on one side. Where are we, Mama? Somewhere different, Sarah said, because she didn't know what else to say. Because different was all she had to offer. Because Montana felt like the edge of the world, and maybe that was exactly where they needed to be. The lawyer had left keys with the county clerk, a 15-minute walk through a town that looked like it had peaked in 1952 and decided to stay there. The clerk was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and suspicion in her eyes that softened when she saw Emma. "You're the Brennan girl," she said. Not a question. "Niece," Sarah corrected. "I didn't know her well." "Nobody did," the woman said, sliding an envelope across the counter. Judith kept to herself, lived alone out there for 40 years after her husband died. Stopped coming into town about 5 years back. Wasn't until the mailman noticed the pileup that anyone checked. "I'm sorry for your loss." Sarah nodded. The loss felt like the wrong word for someone who'd been a stranger. Inside the envelope were 2 keys, a hand-drawn map, and a note in the same shaky handwriting. "Forgive me. Take care of him." The taxi driver who agreed to take them out to the property was a man in his 70s who introduced himself as Earl and didn't ask questions about the garbage bags or why they didn't have luggage. He just loaded them into his ancient Crown Victoria and headed east out of town, into land that rolled and stretched until the sky was more present than the earth. "Brennan Place," Earl said after 20 minutes of silence. Knew Judith a little. Good woman. Hard life. He pulled off the main road onto a gravel drive that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Saplings grew in the tire ruts. Fences sagged like old men. And at the end of the drive, barely visible through a stand of pines, was a house. Sarah felt something crack in her chest. The farmhouse was 2 stories, white paint peeling like sunburned skin, porch sagging on one side, windows dark, shutters hanging. The barn beyond it looked like it was holding itself up through sheer stubbornness. Everything spoke of abandonment, of time passing, of things left behind. "You want me to wait?" Earl asked. Sarah looked at Emma, then at the $73 she had left, and shook her head. "We're staying." Earl nodded, helped them with the bags, refused payment, and left them standing in the driveway as dust settled around them like ash. The key stuck in the lock. Sarah had to force it, shoulder against the door, until something gave with a crack that echoed through the empty porch, and they stumbled into darkness that smelled of dust and time and something else, something alive. Mothballs. Old wood. The ghost of coffee brewed years ago. The house was furnished. That was the first surprise. Not abandoned, not emptied. Frozen. A cup sat on the kitchen table, a ring of ancient coffee dried at the bottom. Mail in a pile by the door, envelopes from 2019 and 2020, bills and catalogs, and a letter with a return address from Lexington, Kentucky. A blanket draped over the couch like someone had just stood up, folded their reading glasses on top of a book. A hardcover biography of Secretariat that Sarah almost missed in the dimness. It felt like a museum, like walking into someone's life after they'd vanished mid-sentence. Like Judith had stepped out for groceries and simply never came back. Emma moved through the rooms with the careful curiosity of a child who'd learned to be quiet, not to take up space, not to ask for things. 7 years old and already fluent in the language of not being a burden. Sarah followed, seeing each room through a fog of exhaustion and disbelief, her mind trying to process that this place, this whole place, with its creaking floors and wallpaper from another era, belonged to them now. 3 bedrooms upstairs, one with a bed made so tight you could bounce a quarter off it, the military corners crisp despite years of settling dust, one filled with boxes labeled in that same shaky handwriting: taxes, vet records, personal, receipts, 1985-1990. One empty, except for a rocking chair facing the window, the seat worn smooth by decades of sitting. A view so specific that Sarah knew immediately this was where Judith had spent her time. That's where Sarah saw it. The view the rocking chair faced. Past the overgrown garden where raspberry bushes had gone wild and taken over what might have been flower beds, past the collapsing split-rail fence with weeds growing through the gaps, to the barn. A massive structure, red paint faded to rust in places, the roof sagging but intact. And standing in the paddock beside it, barely visible in the morning light that cut through the pines at the property's edge, was a horse. Sarah's breath caught. She went downstairs, out the back door, through grass that came up to her knees. Emma ran ahead, fearless in the way of children who haven't learned what the world takes from you. The horse didn't move as they approached. It stood in the center of the paddock like a statue, gray coat dull in the light, ribs showing through skin, head low. Old. So old that Sarah could see it in the sway of its back, the careful way it held its weight. "Mama, is he sick?" Emma whispered. The horse raised its head then, looked at them with eyes that held something Sarah recognized. Endurance. Not hope, not surrender. Just the quiet determination to exist through one more day. There was a name burned into a wooden plaque above the paddock gate, the letters deep and careful. Secretariat's Shadow. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. Secretariat, the horse that had won the Triple Crown in 1973, that had broken records, that still stood, that had become legend, the greatest racehorse in American history. "That's not possible," she said out loud, her voice strange in the open air. But the horse was watching her now, with those ancient eyes, and somewhere in the barn behind them, she heard the rustle of papers caught by wind through gaps in the walls. The barn was in better shape than the house. Inside, someone, Judith, had maintained a small office in the tack room. Feed bags stacked neatly against one wall, 50-pound sacks of senior horse feed. Tools hung on pegboards, each one outlined in marker so you'd know where it belonged. Saddles gathering dust, bridles that looked like they hadn't been used in a decade, and in a locked cabinet that Sarah broke open with a rock, feeling like a thief in her own inheritance, she found them. The papers. Folders thick with documents, organized by year. Bloodline records going back to the 1980s. Stud certificates with official seals. Letters from veterinarians and racing officials, most of them asking questions, demanding answers, looking for information about a horse that shouldn't exist. Photographs, yellow with age, showing a younger version of the horse outside, sleek and powerful, standing beside a man in a winner's circle somewhere, wearing a blanket of roses. But not Secretariat. A son. An unauthorized son. But it was the letter on top, dated 3 weeks before Judith died, that made Sarah's hands shake so badly she had to set it on the workbench to read it. It was from a genetics laboratory in California. DNA confirmation. The horse in the paddock, now 38 years old. An age most horses never reached, an age that made him one of the oldest living thoroughbreds in the country, was the biological son of Secretariat. And not just any son, a son no one knew existed, born in 1987 from frozen semen, a year after Secretariat died of complications from laminitis, raised in secret, kept hidden, never raced, never registered with the jockey club, never sold, never bred, never acknowledged. The letter went on, the language precise and clinical. A syndicate of breeders had been searching for proof of this horse for decades. Rumors had circulated in the thoroughbred racing community since the late 80s about unauthorized collections, about missing samples, about a veterinarian who'd had access to Secretariat's frozen semen and had vanished from the industry after his death. Secretariat's bloodline was worth millions, tens of millions, in breeding rights alone. His descendants commanded stud fees in the hundreds of thousands. His genetic legacy had shaped modern racing. But the horse had vanished after Judith's husband, Dr. Marcus Brennan, a veterinarian who'd worked at the facility where Secretariat's semen was stored for syndication breeding, had died in a car accident in 1985. There had been rumors, whispers at Churchill Downs and Belmont Park. Nothing confirmed, no proof, just speculation and the nagging sense that something valuable had disappeared into the Montana wilderness. Until now. The lab had tracked Judith down 6 months before she died, had made an offer, $20 million for the horse and his breeding rights. She'd refused. The letter asked her to reconsider, to contact them, to name her price. The date on the letter was 2 weeks before Judith had died. Sarah stood in the barn, papers in her hands, and looked out at the horse that was older than she was, that had lived in obscurity while the world searched for him. Emma was standing at the fence now, holding grass through the slats, and the horse, Secretariat's shadow, was walking toward her with slow, careful steps. "What does 'forgive me' mean?" Emma asked when Sarah joined her. Sarah read the note again. "Forgive me. Take care of him. I think," Sarah said slowly, "it means she kept a secret, a big one." The horse took the grass from Emma's hand. Up close, Sarah could see the resemblance in the elegant slope of his neck, the intelligent eyes, the way he held himself despite age and neglect. This was the son of a legend, living like a ghost. Over the next 3 days, Sarah taught herself about horses from books she found in Judith's office, worn paperbacks with titles like Horse Care for Beginners and Geriatric Equine Management, and videos she watched on the library computer in town, taking notes on paper she borrowed from the librarian. She learned how to feed, how to check hooves for cracks or infection, how to recognize pain or illness in an animal that had evolved to hide weakness. She learned that horses were prey animals, that they remembered kindness and cruelty equally, that they could live into their 40s if given proper care. The horse tolerated her attention with the patience of something that had outlived expectation, that had seen people come and go, that had learned to endure without attachment. She also made phone calls to the genetics lab, where a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen answered, and gasped when Sarah identified herself, to breeding syndicates in Kentucky and New York, where men with cultivated voices asked careful questions about the horse's health, his temperament, his viability, to racing historians who gasped when she described the papers, the DNA results, the horse himself standing in a Montana paddock like a ghost made flesh. They all wanted to see him, to verify, to make offers. Some wanted to send representatives immediately. Others begged for photographs. One man offered $50,000 just for confirmation of his location. A representative from the Kentucky Derby Museum drove 14 hours straight to confirm what Sarah already knew, arriving at 2 a.m. with spotlights and a camera crew. The horse was real. The bloodline was confirmed. The genetic markers matched. And in the world of thoroughbred racing, where bloodlines were everything, where a single horse could influence the sport for generations, this was the discovery of a lifetime. The offers started at $20 million, then 30, then 50. Sarah sat at Judith's kitchen table, the same table where the coffee cup still sat, where Judith had opened that final letter from the lab, and watched numbers climb that meant nothing to her except freedom. Freedom from shelters, from sleeping in cars, from the terror of not knowing where Emma would lay her head at night, from fear, from the grinding poverty that had swallowed the last 2 years of her life like quicksand, from explaining to her daughter why other kids had lunch money and birthday parties, and she didn't. But every time she went outside, Emma was at the fence, and the horse was standing close to her, head lowered, accepting the tentative touch of her small hands. "He's lonely," Emma said on the 4th day. "I think he was Aunt Judith's only friend." Sarah thought about the rocking chair facing the window, about a woman who'd kept a secret for 40 years, who'd refused $20 million, who'd lived alone rather than betray the trust of a husband, who'd stolen a horse to save it from being exploited. She thought about what loneliness looked like, what it cost, what it meant to be the keeper of something valuable that the world would destroy for profit. On the 5th day, when a representative from a breeding syndicate offered $75 million, Sarah asked a different question. "What happens to him after?" The man blinked, adjusted his glasses. "After? After you buy him, what happens to the horse?" "Well, we'd transport him to our facility in Kentucky. Begin a breeding program immediately. At his age, we'd use surgical extraction for semen collection. He'd live in climate-controlled stables with round-the-clock care. Best veterinary?" "How long?" Sarah interrupted. "How long would he live?" The man hesitated. "At his age, Mrs. Mitchell, every day is a gift. Our primary concern would be securing as much genetic material as possible while he's still viable. If we could get even a dozen successful collections." "So, you'd use him until he died?" Sarah said. It wasn't a question. The man had the grace to look uncomfortable. "We'd provide excellent care." Sarah showed him out. That night, she sat on the porch with Emma asleep inside and watched the barn through the darkness. The horse was out there, standing in the paddock under stars that had seen everything, known everything, and kept their silence. She thought about Judith, dying alone with a secret, about the note. "Forgive me, not for keeping the horse, for dying, for leaving him without protection, for knowing what the world would do." Sarah made her decision in the dark, under those stars. In the morning, she called a different kind of lawyer, a trust and estate attorney, who listened to her requirements and didn't ask if she was sure. She wanted protection, wanted sanctuary, wanted the horse to live out whatever days he had left in the only home he'd ever known. It took 6 weeks to arrange. 6 weeks of lawyers and phone calls, and men in expensive suits walking the property with clipboards and concerned expressions. 6 weeks of veterinary examinations and genetic testing and paperwork that Sarah signed until her hand cramped. The breeding syndicate that had offered $75 million agreed, after negotiation that went late into Montana nights, to a different deal. They would pay $115 million for exclusive breeding rights to Secretariat's shadow. But the horse would never leave the property. All collection would be done on site by veterinarians of Sarah's choosing, with strict protocols for the horse's welfare written into the contract. Any sign of distress, any decline in health, any indication that the procedures were causing pain or suffering, and the agreement ended immediately. The horse would live and die on the farm where he'd spent his life, in the paddock where he'd stood for decades, under Montana skies that had watched him grow old with dignity. The syndicate would get their bloodline, their chance to breed champions, their piece of racing history. Sarah would get her money. Enough to change everything. Enough to fund scholarships for homeless children, to build shelters that didn't smell like disinfectant and despair, to ensure that other mothers and daughters wouldn't have to sleep in cars or beg for help, and Judith's secret would be honored. The papers were signed on a cold October morning, frost covering the paddock grass, the mountains sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Sarah had spent the previous 2 months fixing up the house with money borrowed against the future sale. New roof, fresh paint, windows that actually closed, repairing the barn, replacing rotten boards, modernizing the office, hiring a ranch manager named Tom Westfield, who'd worked with geriatric horses for 30 years and understood the assignment without Sarah having to explain it. Emma had started school in town, 3rd grade at Whitehall Elementary, making friends, laughing again in a way Sarah had almost forgotten was possible, coming home with art projects and spelling tests and stories about recess, being a child instead of a small ghost of a child. The money hit Sarah's account at 9 a.m. She was standing at the paddock fence, watching Secretariat's shadow graze in the morning light, his breath making clouds in the cold air, when her phone buzzed with the confirmation. $115 million. More money than she could conceptualize, more than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. Enough to change everything. Enough to ensure Emma's future, to help others who'd been where she was, to live without fear. Enough to matter. But the horse just kept grazing, unaware that he'd become the most valuable animal in America, unaware that his existence had shifted from secret to salvation, unaware that the genetics locked in his ancient body would shape racing for another generation. But the horse just kept grazing, unaware that he'd become the most valuable animal in America, unaware that his existence had shifted from secret to salvation. Sarah climbed over the fence, something the ranch manager had taught her to do safely, and walked across the paddock. The horse raised his head, watched her approach, and for the first time since she'd arrived, took steps to meet her halfway. She reached out, touched his neck, felt the warmth of him, the solidness, the quiet truth that some things weren't meant to be owned, only protected. "Thank you," she whispered, to the horse, to Judith, to whatever chance or fate or mercy had brought her here when she'd had nowhere else to go. The horse exhaled against her palm. Emma called from the porch, asking if she could bring carrots. Sarah waved yes and watched her daughter run toward them, fearless and free, and 7 years old in a world that made sense again. This was what Judith had known, that some legacies weren't about money. They were about the quiet responsibility of caring for something precious that the world would consume if you let it. Sarah had been homeless 2 months ago, had been at the bottom, and now she was here, standing in a paddock with a horse worth more than some small countries, and all she felt was gratitude. Not for the money, though that would change their lives in ways she couldn't yet imagine, but for the chance to do what Judith had done, to be the wall between vulnerability and the world, to say no to profit and yes to protection, to choose when it mattered, to be the keeper of something that mattered more. The sun climbed higher. Emma arrived with carrots and stories from school. The horse accepted both with patient grace, and Sarah stood there, on land she now owned, with a future she could barely comprehend, and understood finally what forgiveness meant. Not for keeping secrets, but for trusting a stranger with them, for believing that someone would understand, for passing the weight of care to hands that would hold it gently. She thought she'd come here with nothing, but Judith had left her everything. Not the horse, not the money, but the lesson that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is refuse to let the world take what it wants. That protection is a form of love, that some inheritances are measured not in dollars, but in days, each one a small victory against a world that values profit over peace. The ranch manager called from the barn, asking about feed schedules. Emma ran to help, carrots forgotten in her pocket, and Secretariat's shadow stood beside Sarah in the morning light, living proof that some secrets, when finally told, weren't endings but beginnings. She'd tell Emma the whole story someday, about Judith and her husband Marcus, about the theft that was really a rescue, about a veterinarian who'd loved horses more than rules and had seen what the racing industry did to animals when their value exceeded their welfare, about the 40 years of quiet defiance, of living in poverty to protect a secret, of watching the world search while sitting in a rocking chair and keeping silent, about the choice between wealth and honor, between comfort and conviction, about what it meant to be the guardian of something that mattered. But not today. Not yet. Today was just for standing here, in this place that had been abandoned and was now alive again, with a horse that had been hidden and was now known, and feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, not just relief, but purpose. The kind that doesn't come from having everything. The kind that comes from protecting one thing well. Sarah Mitchell had inherited an abandoned farm from an aunt who was practically a stranger. But what she'd really received was a second chance. For her, for Emma, and for an old horse whose only crime was being born valuable, in a world that would have used him up decades ago, that would have extracted every ounce of genetic worth until there was nothing left but numbers on a page and a body that had given too much. The lawyers would call soon with questions about taxes and trusts and estate planning. The syndicate would send their team next month to begin the first collection procedures. Life would get complicated in ways she couldn't predict, in ways that would require accountants and advisors and people who understood money in amounts she'd never imagined. But for now, in this moment, with the sun warming her shoulders and Emma's laughter echoing from the barn where she was helping Tom feed the barn cats, and the horse, breathing steady beside her, patient and alive and protected, Sarah let herself feel what Judith must have felt for 40 years. The fierce, quiet joy of keeping something safe, of being trusted with a legacy that mattered more than profit, of knowing that when the world came asking, and it had come asking, with its briefcases and contracts and promises, she had the right to say not yet, not like this, not ever on your terms. She'd been at rock bottom, sleeping in a car with her daughter, counting change for gas station coffee, wondering if they'd have anywhere to go when the shelter's 30-day limit expired, and an old horse, living in obscurity in Montana wilderness, unknown and unacknowledged, had lifted her up to heights she'd never imagined. Not through his value, though the value was real and would reshape their lives, but through his presence, through the responsibility of his care, through the reminder that the most important things in life aren't bought or sold. They're chosen, protected, honored, guarded against a world that sees everything as commodity, one day at a time. Emma ran back with Tom, both of them discussing names for the barn cats that had appeared from nowhere, probably feral strays that had been living in the rafters for years. And Sarah smiled. This was home now. Not temporary, not contingent, home. This abandoned place made whole. This hidden treasure, brought to light on its own terms. This impossible inheritance that had saved her life not with money but with meaning. And standing at the center of it all, patient and enduring and ancient, was Secretariat's shadow. No longer a secret, but not yet another commodity. Just a horse, growing old with dignity, surrounded by care, living proof that sometimes the best thing you can inherit isn't money. It's the chance to do right by something that depends on you. The chance to choose protection over profit. The chance to honor a trust. The wind moved through the pines that bordered the property. The same wind that had blown here for decades while Judith sat in her rocking chair and watched. The mountains stood watch, eternal and patient. And Sarah Mitchell, who'd had nothing, who'd been invisible in a world that looked through homeless people like they were glass, understood finally that she'd been given everything. Not the farm, though the deed was in her name. Not the fortune, though the money would change their lives in ways she was only beginning to understand. But the choice, and she'd made it the same way Judith had, with her whole heart pointed toward protection, toward the quiet defiance of saying no to those who wanted to take and use and consume. That was the real inheritance, the one that mattered, the one that would outlast them all. The knowledge that some things, some precious, vulnerable things, were worth more than their market value. That being the wall between something defenseless and a world that wanted to exploit it was perhaps the most important work a person could do. That 40 years of silence and poverty and lonely vigil had been Judith's gift, not to the horse, but to whoever would come next and understand.